In the heartland of America, a small town harbored a chilling secret for over 3 decades. A man terrorized its residents, committing crimes without consequence. Then one day, in broad daylight, he was gunned down in front of dozens of witnesses. Yet, to this day, no one has confessed, and the case remains unsolved. What drove an entire community to silence? How did fear and frustration culminate in a public execution? This is the story of Ken Rex McElroy and the town that chose to take justice into its own hands. Welcome to True Untold Stories. Here, we uncover the most gripping, shocking, and mysterious true stories that the world needs to hear. From crime mysteries and historical secrets to unbelievable real-life experiences, we bring you true, untold stories every single day. So, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey into the unknown. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now let's dive into today's true, untold story. To understand how an entire town stayed silent about a public execution, we have to go back. Back to a time when small-town America was safe. This story takes us to a small town in Missouri, a quiet place where neighbors knew each other, where children played freely in the streets, and where life was simple. Skidmore, Missouri, a town of just a few hundred people, a place where you didn't lock your doors at night because you didn't have to. But in the 1970s, Skidmore was home to a man who changed everything. Ken Rex McElroy. If you were from Skidmore, you knew the name. And if you were unlucky enough, you knew the man. He was more than just a troublemaker. He was a predator, a bully, a man who lived above the law. Some called him cunning, others called him evil. McElroy spent his life taking what he wanted, whether it was property, money, or even people. And no matter what he did, he always got away with it. He had a way of making people fear him, a way of looking at you that sent chills down your spine. And if he didn't get his way, well, bad things happened. This is how Ken Rex McElroy became the most feared man in Skidmore. And this is how, one day, the people of Skidmore decided they'd had enough. McElroy wasn't just any criminal. He was a force of chaos, wrapped in the skin of a man, a predator who roamed the town unchecked, feeding off fear as if it were his birthright. He had a way of making people feel small, powerless. He would swagger into a store, fill his arms with whatever he pleased, and walk out without so much as a glance at the cashier. No one dared to stop him. The few who had tried learned quickly that McElroy didn't forgive, and he never forgot. A store owner who once confronted him found his shop burned to the ground a week later. Another man who had the nerve to demand payment for a pig McElroy had taken woke up to gunshots shredding through his windows in the middle of the night. His crimes weren't just limited to theft. No, McElroy took what he wanted, always. If he wanted your land, you might wake up to find your cattle dead, poisoned. If he wanted your daughter, there was nothing you could do. Parents warned their children to stay away from him, but warnings meant little when he could pluck a girl from her home and dare the law to do something about it, and they never did. Whenever an arrest did come, it was nothing more than a formality. He would sit in the county jail for a few hours, smirking, waiting for his lawyer to arrive. Then, as if following a well-rehearsed script, the legal delays would begin. Paperwork would go missing. A witness would suddenly change their story. The few who stood their ground found themselves at the center of an unrelenting terror campaign. McElroy's methods were simple but devastating. He would park his truck outside a witness's house at night, engine idling, headlights off. He never knocked, never spoke. He just sat there, a dark silhouette against the dim glow of a cigarette, watching. Hours would pass. He wouldn't leave until he was sure they had seen him, until he was sure they understood. Some tried to pretend he wasn't there, but fear has a way of creeping under doors and settling in the bones. A mother, clutching her child, listening to the rumble of his truck just outside. A husband, gripping his shotgun but knowing full well he would never use it. Not against McElroy. Because McElroy wasn't just a man. He was a sickness that had infected the town. People whispered his name like an omen, afraid that even speaking it too loudly might call him forth. And McElroy knew it. He reveled in it. It was a game to him, a game where he always won, until the day he chose the wrong victim. It all started with something so small, something so ordinary, that no one could have predicted it would be the beginning of the end. A piece of candy. Bo Bowenkamp, the local grocer, had been in business for years. He had watched generations of children grow up, coming into his shop with a few coins clutched in their tiny hands, eyes bright with excitement as they picked out their favorite sweets. He was a kind man, patient, the sort who never minded when kids pressed their faces against the glass, or took an extra moment to make their choice. But there were rules, and one of them was simple. If you couldn't pay, you couldn't take. So when he caught McElroy's children stuffing their pockets with candy, he did what any shopkeeper would do. He told them to put it back. Most parents would have handled the situation with embarrassment, maybe a stern word or two. But McElroy wasn't most parents. The kids ran home crying, and whatever story they told their father, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that someone, some nobody grocer, had dared to challenge him. To say no to his children was to say no to him. That was unacceptable. Days passed, and the town forgot about the incident. Bo Bowenkamp didn't think much of it either. He had no reason to. People had told McElroy off before, granted, not many, and never without consequence. But this was different. It was children stealing candy. It wasn't something a grown man would hold a grudge over. But McElroy wasn't just any grown man. One afternoon, the bell over the store door jingled, and in walked McElroy. Not with his usual arrogant saunter, not with the lazy half-smirk people knew too well. This time, there was something colder in his eyes, something slow and deliberate in the way he moved. He didn't come alone. His wife was with him. She was talking, ranting, really, about how Bo had mistreated her children, how he had shamed them, how he had humiliated them in front of everyone. Bo barely had time to react before McElroy started shouting. The argument escalated fast, too fast. McElroy's voice boomed through the small shop, shaking the walls, filling every corner with its rage. His accusations weren't just about the candy anymore. He twisted the story, made it something uglier, something personal. He wanted Bo to cower, to apologize. But Bo Bowenkamp was an old man. He had spent a lifetime in this town, and he wasn't going to let some bully scream him into submission. So he stood his ground, and that was all it took. McElroy stormed out, dragging his wife with him. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that hums with a warning, the kind that leaves a bad taste in the air. Bo shook his head and went back to his work, thinking that was the end of it. But McElroy wasn't finished. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the town, a truck rumbled down the street. It slowed in front of the grocery store. The engine growled like a restless beast. And then, the shotgun fired. Bo Bowenkamp hit the ground. A flash of pain, a rush of heat, his blood pooling around him, seeping into the cracks of the pavement. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then, darkness. Somehow, by some miracle, he survived. But when he woke up in the hospital, the world wasn't the same. Something had shifted. Something had cracked open in the heart of the town. McElroy had finally gone too far. The sheriff had no choice but to arrest him. There was no way around it. An elderly man, a well-respected member of the community, had been gunned down in cold blood. This time, surely, the law would hold. But the people of the town had seen this play out before. They had seen McElroy walk free too many times. And sure enough, it happened again. He posted bond. He walked out of jail like nothing had happened. And then, just days later, he returned. He drove into town like he owned it, his truck rolling to a stop in the middle of Main Street. He sat there, leaning back in the driver's seat, a shotgun across his lap, watching, waiting. It was his signature move, a silent challenge, a reminder that no matter what he did, no one could stop him. He locked eyes with the people passing by, their faces tight with fear and anger. He dared them to do something, dared them to say something. And then he laughed, a slow, deliberate laugh, low and taunting, like a man sharing a private joke with himself. The sound slithered through the street, wrapping around the townspeople like a noose. It wasn't just arrogance. It wasn't just defiance. It was a statement. You can't touch me. And in that moment, right then, right there, the town made its decision. McElroy wasn't going to get away this time. The next morning, the town woke up with a weight in the air, something thick, something unspoken, but understood by everyone. By noon, people began making their way to the local bar. They didn't need flyers. They didn't need phone calls. The news spread in a way that didn't require words. One by one they came, shopkeepers, farmers, mechanics, mothers, grandfathers, people who had spent years living under the shadow of a man they feared but could no longer tolerate. Inside, the bar was packed. The usual clatter of drinks and casual conversation was absent. No one laughed. No one whispered. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that carries decisions too big to speak aloud. They were tired. Tired of locking their doors at night and peeking through the curtains. Tired of telling their children to stay away from him, knowing full well that warnings meant nothing when McElroy wanted something. They were afraid. Afraid of the way his truck would appear like an omen, idling outside their homes. Afraid of the way he would watch them, daring them to make a move, knowing they wouldn't, but most of all, they had had enough. They spoke in low voices, some standing, others sitting, their hands gripping beer glasses they had no intention of drinking from. No one said it outright, but the meaning was there. It had to end. McElroy had ruled this town for too long. The law had failed them too many times. And yesterday, when he had sat in that truck, laughing at them, that had been the final insult. By the time the meeting ended, there were no cheers, no rallying cries, just the sound of chairs scraping against the wooden floor as people stood up, adjusted their coats, and stepped outside. And there, across the street, McElroy, sitting in his truck, just like he always did, smirking, watching them like he had done 100 times before. But this time, something was different. There was no fear, no hesitation, no avoiding his gaze. One by one, the townspeople began to cross the street. Not a handful, not a dozen, 50, maybe 60 of them, moving as one. A silent wall of people, shoulder to shoulder, their footsteps slow, steady, purposeful. McElroy saw them coming. His smirk faltered. For the first time in his life, he was outnumbered. His hand twitched toward the shotgun resting in his lap, but he wasn't fast enough. Before he could react, gunshots were fired. The first shot shattered the windshield, sending shards of glass cascading onto his lap. The next tore through metal, the deafening cracks of gunfire rolling through the street like thunder. Smoke filled the air. People ducked. Others turned their heads, but no one ran. And then, silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound, pressing down on everything, making the world feel still and unreal. Ken Rex McElroy was dead. His truck engine was still running, a faint hum against the quiet. His shotgun, the weapon he had used to intimidate an entire town, sat useless in his lap. No one spoke. No one checked for a pulse. They all knew. And then, as if nothing had happened, as if they had simply finished a long overdue task. The townspeople turned and walked away. When the police arrived, they were met with a sight that should have told them everything. A truck, riddled with bullet holes, a body slumped in the driver's seat, the thick scent of gunpowder still lingering in the air. But when they looked at the crowd gathered nearby, 50, maybe 60 people standing quietly, their faces unreadable, they realized this wasn't going to be like any other crime scene. An officer cleared his throat, glancing at his partner before asking the obvious question. "Who shot Ken Rex McElroy?" Silence. Not a single voice rose to answer. The officers scanned the faces before them, searching for even the smallest crack. Nervous shifting, darting eyes, a hesitant breath. But there was nothing. Just calm, steady gazes. So, they tried again. Did anyone see what happened? More silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear. It wasn't the nervous hush of people too scared to speak. No, this was different. This was something stronger. A choice. 50 people had stood there. 50 people had watched as the most feared man in town was gunned down in broad daylight. Yet, not one of them had seen a thing. Not one had heard the gunshots. Not one had a name to give. No suspects. No confessions. Just a town full of people who had finally taken justice into their own hands and had no intention of letting the law undo what they had done. The case remained open, but it didn't matter. No arrests were ever made. No trial was ever held. McElroy was buried. And then, life in Skidmore returned to normal. For the first time in years, people walked the streets without glancing over their shoulders. Doors that had been locked at dusk were left open to let in the summer breeze. Children played outside without the hushed warnings of their parents. It was as if the weight that had pressed on the town for so long had simply lifted. But beneath it all, the secret remained. People whispered in hushed tones behind closed doors. They speculated, they theorized. Outsiders came, journalists hungry for a confession, detectives hoping to crack the code of a town that refused to speak. But no one talked, not then, not now. Not a single person has ever been held accountable for Ken Rex McElroy's death. Justice had come, not in a courtroom, but in the hands of Skidmore's town members. What happened in Skidmore wasn't just about one man. It was about a community that had been pushed to its breaking point. They had asked for help. The law had failed them. And so they made their own law. Was it right? Was it wrong? That's for you to decide. But one thing is certain. When fear rules a town, people will do whatever it takes to take their lives back. Even if it means keeping a secret forever. This story isn't just about Skidmore. It's about what happens when justice fails, when fear takes over, when a town decides to take matters into its own hands. What do you think? Was this justice or was it murder? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more shocking, untold true stories, subscribe to True Untold Stories, because the world is full of secrets, and we're here to uncover them